If you live off the grid long enough, a certain worry will start growing in the back of your mind. It'll kick in when you hear the sound of a truck you don't recognize coming down your road, or when a neighbor mentions a new county inspector poking around the place. This is when you realize the biggest threats to your freedom don't always come howling from the other side of the tree line. Instead, they come wearing badges and carrying clipboards. If you don't know how to protect your ground, the government can take more from you than a hard winter ever will. So stay with me here and pay close attention. What comes next is exactly what you need to know to get you ready before someone shows up on your doorstep and says, "This has to go." Before a homesteader begins digging trenches, erecting sheds, or installing solar arrays, it pays to know exactly which bodies of authority apply. In many cases, the biggest risk to the off-grid homestead isn't from the federal government. It is from the county, the local zoning board, the health department, or the fire marshal. The zoning map might show a parcel as rural residential, but unless you check the exact land use classification, setbacks, structure size definitions, and the authority of the local building department, that home may appear to the county as unpermitted dwelling or unsafe structure. A homestead that looks remote may still be subject to subdivision rules, septic regulations, or utility mandates. The smart operator traces who enforces what, which department handles structures, who handles water and wastewater, who handles fire and brush, whose rules apply to roads or driveways. When enforcement starts, one of the strongest defenses is having clear evidence of what the land looked like and how the structures evolved. If a structure existed before a zoning change, for example, it may qualify as a non-conforming use. In Michigan, a case involving a farming-zoned parcel showed that even an operation of yard waste composting was struck down because the board found it was not acceptable under the local zoning, despite the owner's view that it had been ongoing. For off-grid homesteads, the practical translation, early photographs, dated receipts for materials, farm or agricultural tax classification records, witness statements from prior owners. If a cabin stood for years before enforcement began, documentation of that time helps. In some situations, older outbuildings can help the owner show the county that the structures were already present and thus grandfathered in. A homesteader might not realize that when a county adopts new building codes, any structure built before the change may be grandfathered and immune from new permit requirements, if the owner can prove the date. Without that proof, a plain-looking shed may be deemed a dwelling and become illegal. This paper trail forms a buffer, not a guarantee, because the county still has powers, but the burden of proof shifts. The landowner is no longer just interpreting rules. The county must show the violation. For those living off-grid, it means taking photos of the yard, the structure, the system, the land map, ideally from day one. For many off-grid homesteaders, one of the biggest problems they encounter is the county, or a local utility, trying to force a reconnection to public power, water, or sewer systems. Across the country, officials have used health and safety language to justify forcing grid hookups, even when the off-grid systems in place work better than half the infrastructure in town. A well-known example unfolded in Cape Coral, Florida, where a woman living self-sufficiently was told by local code enforcement that her home was unsafe because it wasn't connected to city water and power. Despite her functioning solar system and purified water supply, she was ordered to reconnect or vacate. The case made national news because it revealed how quickly a city can declare off-grid systems non-compliant, even if they meet every practical need. A similar situation happened in Moab, Utah, where certain rural residents were pressed to hook into municipal water lines after the city expanded its boundary. Some owners had perfectly clean well water, but city officials insisted on uniformity. Those who resisted faced mounting pressure through code citations and escalating fines. And in Los Angeles County, tiny home dwellers and remote cabin owners have repeatedly run into enforcement actions when the county insisted that all habitable structures must have permanent power and sewer connection, rules originally designed for dense suburbs, not canyon cabins 2 miles up a dirt track. These examples make one thing painfully clear. If the county decides your home falls under rules that require utility service, they can squeeze you until you comply. The key is understanding what rights shield you and how to build your homestead so you aren't mistaken for someone violating code. Staying on topic, let's talk about water rights. If a homesteader controls their own water rights, regulators have a much harder time forcing municipal water hookups. Consider the landmark Colorado rainwater case from earlier years, when strict laws initially prohibited homeowners from collecting rainwater because the rain was legally considered part of someone else's water rights downstream. These rules have since been loosened, but the case revealed a simple truth. In many states, water is a legal property in itself, and controlling that right gives you leverage. In New Mexico, off-grid families in Taos County famously resisted attempts to impose standard water system hookups on earthship communities. Those residents relied on a closed-loop system of rain capture, treatment, and reuse. The county challenged the legality of the system, but because many homeowners held valid water permits and could demonstrate safe reuse, the community ultimately held on to self-reliance. And in Oregon, there have been well-publicized cases where landowners were prosecuted for diverting water without permits, even when the water flowed through their property. These cases show the necessity of knowing exactly what rights come with your land. A homesteader with a registered well or senior water rights has a shield that someone relying on surface diversion does not. Water rights don't just matter for irrigation. They can determine whether the county can force you onto their pipes. There is a principle in resilient homestead living. You don't need to look like the compound to be self-sufficient. In fact, you're better off not looking like a target. Enforcement often begins not with a lawsuit, but with an image. A new paved driveway, bright metal roofs reflecting satellite imagery, gates, signage, cameras. These can all raise the eyebrows of a zoning official or assessor. It's an important lesson. Compliance isn't enough if you broadcast your entire system online and, in doing so, draw the gaze of regulators. A low-profile homestead blends into its surroundings, uses natural tones, avoids excessive improvements that signal development, and keeps social media exposure minimal or strategically curated. The style of your living matters as much as the substance. A cabin on skids behind trees looks a lot less provocative than a new steel structure with runway lighting. The fewer complaints you generate, the fewer complaints inspectors receive, and the fewer inspections in your driveway. That quiet presence is part of the defense. Many homesteaders believe enforcement begins with an inspector showing up unannounced, but the reality is different. Most actions begin with a complaint. A neighbor sees a shed, a driveway pivoting, a trailer parked, and picks up the phone. The county follows the call. Inspectors may ask for consent to enter. If consent is given, the rules change. There are documented cases of off-grid owners being caught because they let inspectors walk their site voluntarily, answered questions, and inadvertently revealed structures or systems that triggered regulation. In one case in Kentucky involving an off-grid family, child welfare, zoning, and building issues all converged when the state challenged the parents for raising children off-grid. The lesson is, meet gate to gate if possible. Ask for credentials. Ask for the reason. Don't talk your way into a permit requirement. Where state law allows you to deny entry, do so politely. Even a simple sign, "No trespassing, authorized personnel by appointment only," can shift the dynamic legally. When enforcement arrives, it's not about confrontation. It's about procedure. If they don't have a search warrant, you are not obligated to let them wander. The operator who understands that procedure and keeps contact minimal retains more leverage. And in many cases, once the inspection begins, the clock starts ticking. Appeal processes exist, and many counties back down when the homesteader doesn't comply immediately but appeals. Advanced operators know that appealing a notice forces the county to prove its case, and that often they cannot. Every homesteader should know that land use classification often matters more than anything written on a utility bill. If your land is categorized as agricultural, timber, rangeland, or open-use rural, the county frequently has far fewer levers to pull. In many cases, agricultural parcels are exempt from mandatory hookups because they're not considered residential dwellings in the same legal sense. You can see this play out in Texas, where agricultural landowners outside city limits often operate legally without grid-tied electricity or municipal water, because their structures qualify as farm outbuildings rather than dwellings. The rules technically allow a barn or workshop on agricultural land to run off independent power without triggering residential codes. Another example comes from Montana, where rural parcels zoned for agricultural or grazing use can often maintain their off-grid systems without municipal connection requirements, so long as the owner can demonstrate ongoing agricultural activity, crops, livestock, even small-scale hay production. The zoning fights there aren't about solar panels. They're about whether the land is actively used for agriculture. The classification of your land can spare you from forced hookups. If your property is zoned in a way that treats your structures as agricultural accessories rather than modern suburban homes, the county has fewer claws to sink into you. One of the most misunderstood tools in the off-grid arsenal is the microgrid. In Alaska, remote villages often operate microgrids that supply power to clusters of cabins or homes. These aren't rogue systems. They're legal, regulated, and treated as utility cooperatives. Because of that status, the law recognizes them as self-contained power providers, not houses that lack utilities. In California, microgrids have received state-level recognition, especially after wildfire shutoffs left thousands without power. Certain homesteads and communities have legally designated their shared solar systems as microgrids, allowing them to operate independently while still meeting state requirements for safe operation. In Vermont, Green Mountain Power actively supports microgrid adoption, and some rural parcels legally operate independent systems that serve multiple buildings. These owners are not required to reconnect to the main grid because their off-grid system meets recognized safety and reliability standards. When a homestead declares a microgrid, either solo or shared, it becomes a regulated system rather than a house without utilities. That shift in language can mean the difference between being left alone and being red-tagged. It doesn't matter how remote a property is. The minute a county looks at ownership records, your name and your setup become a target if you appear different. Many homesteaders protect themselves by holding land through trusts or LLCs. While it's not a shield from all regulation, it does discreetly separate personal identity from the land and removes the spotlight from your name. The true value lies in the psychology of not being an outlier on the tax rolls. Another dimension: private roads and easements. If your driveway is a county-maintained road, there's a public right-of-way and more authorities involved. But if you establish a private drive, perhaps on a recorded easement, you reduce one layer of oversight. The homestead becomes an enclave rather than a subdivision. Several rural homesteads in the U.S. have adopted private road status and have not had county planning road improvement notices sent to them for years. And for those holding livestock or firearms beyond typical residential levels, an operating agreement within the LLC can help clarify that the activity is part of an agricultural enterprise rather than a commercial nuisance or unpermitted business. These are advanced moves, yes, but they create distance between you and the conventional county homeowner. The big voice many off-grid folks fear is eminent domain, the government taking land for public use. While rare, it does happen. Remember, land actively used for agriculture is less likely to be seized than idle plots. A publication by the Farmland Information Center explains how land zoned agricultural and in active use has special protection from annexation or development. What it means is that if your land is being used, you have a reason for being there. If it's dormant, it becomes unused real estate in the eyes of a city planning board. For homesteaders, this translates to maintaining that garden, keeping logs stacked, livestock grazing, or whatever your site allows so it doesn't look abandoned. For example, land in Minnesota that is part of an agricultural parcel is treated specially for homestead exemption rules. By staying active, you increase your status from potential development site to productive use site. Even if your road is slated for widening or a power line for expansion, a homestead that has been functioning for years can negotiate far better than a still vacant lot. Planning ahead means attending county or township planning commission meetings. Many times, plans are drawn years ahead and posted publicly. If a road is proposed near your land, you'll know long before someone shows up with an order. A lesser-spoken truth in off-grid living is that bureaucracy isn't always an enemy. Relationships are. A homesteader who becomes known as part of the fabric of the county, rather than as a rebel, often finds inspections go easier, notices less frequent, and code officers more friendly. One late-season example: a homesteader volunteering with the county extension office got to present at a farm tour event. The local assessor and zoning officer recognized him and were far less aggressive when a permit question arose. This is not about bending rules, it's about establishing goodwill so you're not the guy on the outskirts. Buy supplies locally instead of online when you can. Attend local township meetings. Know your county commissioner, sheriff, fire chief. When folks know your face and your truck and your name, you're less likely to show up on a non-compliant structures list. It's basic community integration. A heart of the off-grid life is self-reliance, but that doesn't mean isolation from neighbors, especially when one of your neighbors is the county building inspector. But let's say the moment arrives, you get a knock, a notice, a letter, maybe a citation. That's the moment your preparation shows up. Enforcement doesn't always mean you lose. In fact, many times the county will withdraw when the landowner appeals or demands evidence. In a documented case in Florida, code enforcement targeted a woman for living off the grid and lack of utilities. The case drew national attention, and the enforcement action was eventually challenged in court. When enforcement shows up, the best approach is to keep the interaction outside your structures. Record the encounter if state law allows. Ask for credentials, ask for reason, and ask for written notice. Show zero panic. Don't expand the inspection beyond what's required. Avoid volunteering information. If the notice demands a permit or removal of a structure, file an appeal immediately. Many counties have timelines. Missing the deadline means automatic loss, but filing the appeal forces them into process. Many codes don't survive process if the homesteader holds the line. When the matter escalates to court, having the documentation, the classification, the agricultural use, the trust or LLC owning the land, all of that matters. The aim is not confrontation, but legitimate resistance, showing that one is operating within the bounds of property rights and agricultural/low-impact use. The difference between a homestead being shut down and a homestead being left alone is often procedural. Did the owner respond, appeal, document, meet the standards? Or did they ignore, hope it goes away, and eventually get a red tag? The latter is much riskier. Off-grid living in America isn't a solo act of defiance. It's a craft. It's about curving around rules without breaking them, about building the homestead you envisioned with one eye on the land and the other on the permit office. It's about knowing that the government is less the enemy and more the system whose mechanisms you must understand. It's not about hiding in the weeds. It's about living with clarity so the weeds don't swallow you. There was a time when wilderness tracts were truly off the grid and outside oversight. Today, even remote parcels are checked from satellites, assessed via GIS, linked to driveways, and flagged when development occurs. An owner in Arizona talked about how county satellite enforcement caught a cabin before framing was finished. So the modern off-grid builder must respect that oversight exists. even when you choose to live quietly. The builder chooses his materials, his layout, his utilities, not merely for independence, but for invisibility to the administrative gaze. Solar panels? Yes, but placed so they don't glint like signal mirrors. Driveway? Yes, but unpaved or minimally landscaped. Structure? Yes, but sized so you avoid permit triggers. Composting toilet? Yes, but certified so it doesn't become a septic nightmare. Off-grid living is more than the absence of power lines. It's the presence of sovereignty. Sovereignty doesn't mean above the law. It means knowing the law, using the law, and living under it on your own terms. The difference between a homestead that thrives and one that gets bulldozed is how well the owner treats regulation as part of the ecosystem. Code is part of the ecosystem. Land use, classification, tax status, zoning, building permits, they are the terrain you navigate. The successful homesteader doesn't act like a rebel who refuses all oversight. He acts like a pioneer who understands the lay of the land, including the land of regulations, and uses that knowledge to survive and thrive. The off-grid lifestyle is built on fences, wires, pumps, crops, chickens, and on the confidence that you know what you're doing. The land you claim, the roof you raise, the system you install, they are all acts of independence. But protecting that independence is not about fighting the system. It's about mastering it. A well-documented site, a properly classified parcel, low-impact construction, minimal complaints, community ties, and the procedural knowledge to respond when enforcement comes. All these knit together into the armor of sovereign homesteading. There's no magic bullet. There's just preparation, strategy, awareness, and discipline. To live off-grid in America today is to accept that freedom and oversight walk side by side. You step into the woods to escape the grid, but you stay informed to avoid the fine print. You might build your life with your hands, but you build your defense with your mind. And when the truck follows the driveway, you're ready, not because you expected trouble, but because you respected the world you stepped into. You earn your homestead not just by how you build it, but by how you protect it.